Hello, this is an article review on the future of diplomacy, 5 Projective Visions by Erickson A. Allen. The presentation outline is thus: Number 1, introduction and context. We'll look at the evolution of diplomacy, the 5 projective visions of the future of diplomacy, and these projective visions, according to Erickson, are disintermediation, Europeanization, democratization, thematization, Americanization rather. And we have the analysis and conclusion. Going forward, the core of the argument or the text nucleus are the consequences of economics, globalization, and technology on international relations, and elements of alternative and future histories underpin the future of diplomacy. And the writer indirectly gives a wake-up call to traditional diplomats before they reach total irrelevance in this article. The strength of the article, of course, the article emphatically states that the increase in non-state actors in the practice of diplomacy is rapidly effacing traditional diplomacy. The limitation of this article is that most of the arguments are from superficial analysis, thus claims lack sufficient evidences. There are little evidences from Africa and Asia and other continents of the world. Most of the writings were mainly on Europe and America. Moving forward, the context. Alan K. Erickson is a native of Iowa. Is Lee E. Dex, Professor of Diplomatic History Emeritus, is the founding director of Diplomatic Study at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His area of expertise, of course, are international security, and he has a host of research interests, which, of course, one is the history, theory, and practice of diplomacy. The context of this article is pretty straightforward. It was published in March 2005, and the context, the background to this this publication is that the events of international relations in the 2000s were terrific and horrific. The scope and nature of diplomacy had changed. Diplomacy had increasingly become multilateral. Over a dozen forms and kinds of diplomacy emerged with laudable results, such as dollar diplomacy, military diplomacy, public diplomacy, economic diplomacy, and so on. But worthy to note, this is a very relevant source to build on the possible future of diplomacy. To review this article is essential we have an understanding of the evolution of diplomacy. And here, the term diplomacy comes from the Greek diplos. It means duplicated. And the carrier of one became a diplomat, and his work was tagged diplomacy. And you have also the actual meaning of the term diplomacy was first used in England in 1787, and it related to the science that allows the retrieval of rights enshrined in the old charters and on which sovereigns could maintain claims. Moving further, you have more definitions of diplomacy, but a more recent definition by Batson says diplomacy is concerned with the management of relations between states and between states and other actors. In this way, he expands the scope of diplomacy. These definitions in this discourse, the discussion stresses the ongoing revolution in the art and science of diplomacy. These definitions agree with Erickson that diplomacy is continuously evolving. Going to the 5 projective visions proper of diplomacy according to Erickson, you have disintermediation. The strength of disintermediation is that state-run diplomacy with its formal structures and bureaucratic procedures could be largely bypassed, and the weakness is diplomatic profession will be required to mimic private enterprise and its methods. And the concept of Europeanization states it talks about the process of European integration. You have the example of the common foreign and security policies and all their activities. And also, democratization is a third projective vision, and is the concept of diplomacy as democracy. It emphasizes the sovereign equality of states. It supports the existence of multilateral structures to good equal representation. And with democratization, diplomats will get more involved with multilateral work. The limitations of these are resolution mongering and long rolling may gain the deliberations of situations in democratization. And thematization, the fourth projective vision, is a rise of theme-related or thematic diplomacy. It's a way of mobilizing the resources of society and also of mobilizing public opinion internationally as well as at home. And the strength of thematization is that it creates chances for career advancement. It encourages collaboration between all actors of diplomacy. It basically feeds public diplomacy. And a limitation is the endangerment of institutions and standards. An example of thematization is the Black Tuesday of EndSARS Nigeria that took place on the 20th of October 2020, or the outbreak of famine in the Sahel, or a SARS epidemic. The fourth projective vision, Americanization. Americanization simply says that American politics sees American politics as world politics model. Diplomacy will be about reaching to the United States, and its strength is that there will be flexibility in relations, and countries may have, but a limitation is that countries may have more effect from the domestic policy rather than the foreign policy, like that of relation, or like that relationship that exists between Canada and the U.S. And to go into the analysis, we'll pointedly state how the core of this argument is to expose how economics, globalization, and technology are the main drivers of this continuous evolution and the art and science of diplomacy. And authors like Bassin and like in the changing nature of diplomacy, like Hawking and Melicin in Diplomacy in the Digital Age, these authors relatively agree with Henriksen's core argument, but they have slightly different interpretations for the future of diplomacy. And this methodological approach of his paper based on content analysis helps us see the future of diplomacy in this light. One, that the present-day diplomats should have open-mindedness. Secondly, skills and capacity. That means the regular or the traditional diplomat should aim at improving her skills so that he or she can easily fit into other diplomatic shoes or responsibilities. Preservation of traditional diplomacy ethics. This material gives us an understanding to revive or to sustain traditional diplomatic ethics by passing it on to upcoming diplomats as well. This can be a solution per se to this evolving state of diplomacy. Also, above all, Eriksen says that we uphold sanctity of humanity. We see in everything he said that a diplomat ought to uphold the sanctity of humanity, and by recognizing amid the changing vows or the positive changes or the negative changes of society, a diplomat should maintain her core purpose, which is representation and negotiation for the good of her country's foreign policy, and above all, the sanctity of human existence. Our major reference is from Henriksen A. 2005, The Future of Diplomacy, 5 Projective Visions, and Batson 2003. We have The Changing Nature of Diplomacy and Modern Diplomacy book, and Hawking and Melissa, and a host of other materials. Thank you so much. I hope this has been very educative and enlightening, and apt, of course. Thank you very much.